April 1941. A report arrived at the Kriegsmarine headquarters in Berlin. It came from the Naval Command in occupied France, specifically from officers overseeing convoy operations in the English Channel. The report described an engagement the previous night. A German convoy, 3 merchant vessels escorted by armed trawlers, had been attacked off the French coast. The attack lasted approximately 12 minutes. One merchant ship was sunk, another was damaged. The escorts never got a clear shot at the attackers. What made the report unusual wasn't the attack itself. British air raids and submarine activity were expected. What caught attention was the description of the attacking vessels. Small, extremely fast, wooden construction, armed with torpedoes and automatic weapons. They'd appeared from darkness, attacked at close range, and disappeared before the escorts could effectively respond. The report estimated their speed at over 30 knots, possibly 40. The officer who filed the report added a note. "These are not motorboats as we understand them. These are something different." He was right. The British had introduced something the German Navy hadn't anticipated. Motor torpedo boats and motor gun boats, MTBs and MGBs, operating as coordinated fast attack craft in coastal waters. And the Germans didn't know what to make of them. To understand why these vessels were so unusual, you have to understand what naval warfare looked like in 1940. Ships were made of steel. They were designed to absorb punishment. Naval doctrine emphasized armor, firepower, and endurance. Even small vessels, destroyers, corvettes, minesweepers, were built to survive combat damage. The British coastal forces took a completely different approach. The motor torpedo boats were built of wood, mahogany planking over wooden frames. They were between 70 and 75 feet long. They displaced around 40 tons fully loaded. They had no armor. None. A rifle bullet could penetrate the hull, but they were fast. The early models could reach 40 knots. Later versions exceeded 45 knots in calm seas. That's over 50 miles per hour on water. They carried torpedoes, typically 2, sometimes 4, mounted in tubes on the deck. And they carried heavy machine guns, multiple gun positions. Some mounted 20mm cannons. They operated at night, almost exclusively at night. They'd leave British coastal bases at dusk, cross the channel, hunt German convoys or patrol boats, attack, and return before dawn. The motor gun boats were similar, but configured differently. Less focus on torpedoes, more on gunfire. They were designed to engage German E-boats, Germany's own fast attack craft, and to suppress convoy escorts during MTB attacks. Together, operating in coordinated flotillas, they created a form of naval warfare the Germans hadn't prepared for. Small, fast, invisible in darkness, striking suddenly and withdrawing before conventional naval forces could respond. The first German response was skepticism. When reports of these fast wooden boats started accumulating in 1941, many senior German naval officers didn't take them seriously. Wooden boats couldn't survive in combat. That was established naval wisdom. Wood splinters under gunfire. It catches fire. It can't mount heavy weapons without structural problems. And small boats couldn't operate effectively in open water. The English Channel is not a calm sea. It's often rough, especially at night. Small boats would be thrown around, their crews unable to function, their weapons impossible to aim accurately. The early reports must be exaggerated. Convoy captains overestimating the speed of attackers. Visibility problems causing confusion. Perhaps these were just conventional motorboats getting lucky. But the reports kept coming, and they were consistent. Fast boats, wooden construction, operating at night, coordinated attacks, high speed even in moderate seas. The German naval staff commissioned an intelligence assessment. What they learned troubled them. The British had been developing these boats since before the war. They'd experimented with different hull designs, different engines, different tactical doctrines. By 1941, they'd refined the concept into something effective. The boats used high-powered aircraft engines, Packard or Rolls-Royce engines, adapted for marine use. Multiple engines per boat, giving redundancy and the power needed for extreme speed. The wooden construction, initially seen as a weakness, was actually an advantage. Wood didn't show up on radar, and German coastal radar was still primitive. Wood was also easier to repair than steel. Damage that would take weeks to fix on a steel vessel could be patched on a wooden boat in days. The hulls were designed specifically for rough water. Hard Chinese, pronounced V-bottoms, stepped hulls in some models. They could maintain speed in seas that would slow conventional vessels. And the British were building them fast. Dozens were already operational. More were being built at small boatyards around Britain, yards that couldn't build steel warships, but could build wooden boats. By late 1941, the German assessment concluded this was not a minor nuisance. This was a genuine tactical challenge. What worried German naval planners wasn't that individual boats could sink ships. Any torpedo-armed vessel could do that. What worried them was the implications. The Kriegsmarine controlled the Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain. German convoys moved constantly, carrying supplies, troops, equipment between ports. These convoys had to move at night because daylight meant British air attacks. But night was when the MTBS and MGBS operated. German convoy escorts were designed to fight submarines and defend against air attack. They weren't designed to fight fast surface craft in darkness. The escorts couldn't keep up. A convoy moved at 10 or 12 knots, the speed of the slowest merchant ship. The escorts moved perhaps 20 knots maximum. The British boats moved at 40 knots. The escorts couldn't see them. Radar was unreliable at night against small wooden targets. Visual spotting was impossible until the boats were already attacking. And the escorts couldn't catch them. By the time convoy commanders realized they were under attack, the MTBS were already withdrawing at speeds no escort could match. This created an unsolvable problem. German convoys in coastal waters were vulnerable every night. The British controlled the initiative. They could choose when and where to attack. They could concentrate forces against weak points, and they could withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. Kapitän zur See Friedrich Ruge, a senior German naval officer responsible for coastal convoy protection, wrote in his war diary, "These boats represent a form of warfare for which our current defenses are inadequate. We respond to their attacks, but we do not prevent them." That admission, that prevention was impossible with current assets, was significant. It meant the Germans would have to adapt, find new tactics, deploy new weapons, divert resources, all to counter wooden boats built in small boatyards. The German response evolved through several stages. First, they tried to fight boats with boats. Germany had its own fast attack craft, E-boats, called S-boats by the Germans. Schnellboote. These were steel-hulled, diesel-powered, and very effective. They'd been operating since 1939. The Germans increased E-boat patrols in areas where British coastal forces operated. E-boat versus EMTB engagements became common in the Channel. But this had limitations. E-boats were valuable assets. Using them for convoy escort meant they weren't available for offensive operations against British shipping. And in close-range night combat, the British boats were at least equal to E-boats. Second, they improved convoy protection. Dedicated anti-small craft escorts were developed, faster escort vessels, better searchlights, more automatic weapons, 20mm and 37mm guns that could engage fast-moving targets. This helped. But it didn't solve the problem. You could make attacks more costly, but you couldn't prevent them. Third, they tried defensive tactics. Convoys were routed closer to shore, within range of coastal artillery. This limited the areas where British boats could attack, but it also made convoys more vulnerable to mines and limited routing options. Some convoys were broken into smaller groups. The theory was that smaller groups presented less attractive targets, but smaller groups needed escorts too, and there were never enough escorts. Night movements were sometimes suspended during periods when British activity was high. But suspending movements wasn't a solution. Supplies still needed to move. Fourth, and most telling, they tried to develop similar capabilities themselves. By 1942, the Germans were examining captured British MTBs. They studied the hull designs, the engines, the tactics. Some German officers advocated building similar craft, but Germany's industrial base was fully committed. Building wooden motorboats meant diverting resources from submarines, destroyers, and other priorities. The yards that could build them were already building E-boats. So the Germans adapted, but they never fully solved the problem the British coastal forces presented. One aspect that particularly frustrated German commanders was intelligence. Where were the British boats based? How many were operational? What were their operational patterns? The boats operated from bases along the British coast: Portsmouth, Dover, Felixstowe, Great Yarmouth, and others. But identifying specific boats and tracking their movements was nearly impossible. They operated at night. They were wooden, so radar detection was unreliable. They were fast, so they could reach the French coast, attack, and return to England in a single night, leaving little time for German reconnaissance aircraft to spot them in daylight. The British also practiced good operational security. Radio traffic was minimal. Boats operated under radio silence during missions. Code names changed frequently. German intelligence knew generally that British coastal forces were expanding, but specific information, how many boats, where they'd strike next, what their limitations were, remained elusive. This uncertainty complicated German planning. Defenses had to be spread across the entire coastline. Every convoy had to be protected, as if attack was imminent. Resources couldn't be concentrated, because the threat could appear anywhere. One German naval intelligence report from 1943 stated bluntly, "We estimate British coastal forces at between 150 and 300 vessels. We cannot provide more precise numbers. We cannot predict their operations with reliability. We recommend assuming threat is present in all coastal zones at all times." That recommendation, assume the threat is everywhere, revealed the extent of German uncertainty. By 1943, German convoy commanders had developed informal best practices for dealing with British coastal forces. Convoys moved close to shore when possible. This limited the angles of attack and kept vessels within range of coastal defenses. Multiple searchlights were standard equipment. When attack was suspected, all lights would illuminate simultaneously, trying to blind or spot the attackers. Escorts were positioned to respond to likely attack vectors. If a convoy was moving north along the French coast, escorts would concentrate on the seaward side, where British boats would approach from. Star shells and flares were used liberally. At any indication of attack, the sky would be lit up, trying to strip away the darkness the British boats relied on. Some escorts carried smoke generators. The theory was that smoke would confuse torpedo targeting. In practice, smoke also confused the convoy's own navigation, so this was rarely used. And crucially, convoy speed was sometimes varied. A convoy might slow down suddenly, hoping that a torpedo spread aimed at the convoy's predicted position would miss. These adaptations reduced losses, but they didn't eliminate them. British coastal forces continued operating successfully throughout the war. The British coastal forces had effects beyond the ships they sank. They forced the Germans to divert resources, escorts, aircraft, patrol vessels, coastal artillery, all dedicated to defending against small wooden boats. They tied down German E-boats. Instead of offensive operations against British convoys, E-boats spent more time on defensive patrols. They complicated German logistics. Moving supplies by coastal convoy became slower, more expensive, more uncertain. Some routes were avoided entirely after repeated attacks, and they demonstrated that small, inexpensive vessels operating with good tactics could challenge conventional naval forces. This lesson wasn't lost on the Germans, but by the time they fully understood it, their strategic situation made response difficult. Germany was building submarines and fighting a defensive war. Developing new tactical concepts for coastal warfare was a lower priority. German naval records from 1942 to 1943 show ongoing debates about how to handle the British coastal forces threat. Some officers advocated for more aggressive responses. Send E-boats across the channel to attack British bases, mine the approaches to British ports, use air attacks on boat bases. These operations were attempted, but British bases were well defended. Mining British waters was difficult and costly. Air attacks had limited effect on dispersed small targets. Other officers argued for defensive prioritization, except that some losses were inevitable. Focus on protecting the most important convoys. Don't waste resources chasing boats that move faster than your pursuit vessels. A few officers suggested more radical solutions. Build hundreds of small, fast patrol boats, not to fight British MTBS directly, but to create layers of defense that would force British boats to fight their way through before reaching convoys. But none of these approaches were fully implemented. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. Naval priorities were Atlantic U-boats and capital ship preservation. Coastal forces, however troublesome, were a secondary concern. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat force before becoming commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, acknowledged the problem in his memoirs after the war. The British coastal forces represented innovative thinking. Small craft, properly employed, were cost-effective compared to their impact on our operations. That phrase, cost-effective, captures what concerned German planners. The British were getting significant results with relatively small investment. The Germans were expending disproportionate resources defending against them. As the war progressed, British coastal forces evolved. Later, MTBS were faster, better armed, and more reliable. Some carried radar, giving them an advantage in night engagements. Coordination improved. Boats operated in larger flotillas with specialized roles. By 1944, British coastal forces were operating aggressively along the Norwegian coast, the Dutch coast, and the French coast. They attacked E-boats, supported commando raids, laid mines, and conducted reconnaissance. The Germans continued adapting. Late-war E-boats were heavily armed specifically to fight MTBS. New escort vessels were designed with rapid-fire weapons. Radar improved, but the fundamental equation didn't change. Small, fast boats operating at night in coastal waters remained difficult to counter. Looking back from a strategic perspective, the British coastal forces represented something the German Navy hadn't adequately prepared for: asymmetric warfare at sea. The British weren't trying to match German naval power conventionally. They were using different capabilities: speed, maneuverability, surprise, to achieve tactical goals that conventional forces couldn't counter effectively. This wasn't new in principle. Small craft attacking larger vessels had historical precedent. But the British had refined the concept, industrialized it, and employed it systematically. The German Navy, trained to think in terms of battleships and cruisers and submarines, initially didn't recognize the threat. When they did recognize it, they struggled to respond, because the response required different thinking, different equipment, and resources they didn't have to spare. It's a pattern that appears repeatedly in military history. Innovation that challenges established doctrine is often dismissed until its effectiveness becomes undeniable. By then, the opportunity to counter it easily has passed. The story of German reactions to British coastal forces isn't dramatic in the way of major naval battles. There was no single decisive engagement, no dramatic turning point. Instead, it's a story of accumulation. Small attacks, modest losses, persistent pressure, night after night, month after month, for years. And the reaction: gradual recognition, attempted adaptation, ultimate acceptance that the problem couldn't be fully solved with available resources. The British coastal forces never dominated naval warfare. They never sank a battleship or turned the tide of a major campaign. But they achieved something equally important. They forced the Germans to respond, to divert resources, to accept limitations, to acknowledge that control of coastal waters couldn't be taken for granted. For the German Navy, which had begun the war confident in its coastal defenses and convoy protection capabilities, the British MTBS and MGBS were an unwelcome lesson in how unexpected innovation could disrupt even well-planned operations. A 70-foot wooden boat, carrying a crew of 12 and armed with torpedoes and machine guns, shouldn't have been a strategic concern for a major navy. But when operated skillfully, in numbers, with good intelligence and sound tactics, those wooden boats became exactly that. The Germans never stopped trying to counter them. Better escorts, improved tactics, enhanced air patrols, more E-boats. But they never eliminated the threat, because the fundamental advantage lay with the attacker, choosing when and where to strike, moving faster than the response, disappearing into darkness. By 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, British coastal forces had been operating successfully against German coastal convoys for 3 years. Their presence was expected, their tactics were understood, their capabilities were respected, but German convoys still had to move at night, and British MTBS and MGBS were still out there, somewhere in the darkness. Fast, silent, unexpected. Proof that in warfare, sometimes the most disruptive innovations aren't the biggest or most powerful weapons. Sometimes they're the ones that force your opponent to fight in ways they didn't plan for, with resources they can't spare, against threats they can't quite eliminate. The German Navy learned that lesson in the cold waters of the English Channel, one convoy attack at a time. And by the time they'd fully understood it, the strategic initiative had long since passed to the Allies. The wooden boats had done their job.